In the harsh Montana winter of 1875, the faith of widow Sarah Collins had worn nearly as thin as her children's coats. Facing the loss of her only home and with nothing left but prayer, she desperately needed a miracle. And then, on a furious night of wind and snow, a miracle arrived, but it came in the form of a dying man who collapsed at her door. He was dressed like a king, yet he was covered in blood and bore the wounds of a gunfight. With barely enough food for her own children, Sarah faced a choice that could either ruin them completely or save them all. What secret did the stranger carry? And how could one simple act of kindness reshape the destiny of an entire family forever? The rocking chair William had carved from oak 4 years prior now stood motionless in the corner, shrouded in a thin layer of dust Sarah couldn't bring herself to wipe away. Its rhythmic creak had once been the sound of evening, a steady promise that all was right in their world. Now its stillness was a shout that echoed through the small log home, a constant reminder of all that was gone outside. The March wind of Montana sang a lonely tune through the gaps in the wall's chinks William's broad, sure hands would have sealed long ago. Pneumonia didn't wait for fair weather or finished chores. It had come like a thief in the winter. Night and stolen not just the husband she adored, but their fragile sense of security dot through the single window pane. Sarah watched her 2 children. Emma, only 10 but already carrying the weight of an adult on her narrow shoulders, was showing her younger brother how to stack the dry kindling. Thomas, at 8, was trying so hard to be sturdy, swinging his father's axe with a concentration that both swelled her heart with pride and broke it in two. He was trying to fill a space far too large. They were the reason she rose each morning, and the reason fear gnawed at her each night. The flour bin was more dust than substance, and their small herd had dwindled to 2 lean milk cows. Last week, she had sold her father's violin, a final family heirloom, just to purchase seeds for a spring crop. She wasn't sure she had the strength to plant alone. Mr. Caldwell's visit from the bank last Tuesday still hung in the air like a bad frost. He had sat in their best chair, his hat on his knee, his sympathy as thin as his mustache. 90 days, Mrs. Collins, he'd said, consulting a gold pocket watch as if his own time were as precious as hers. The board has been more than patient. 90 days. To conjure a miracle. Mama, only 2 eggs today, Emma announced as she came inside, her young face unnaturally solemn. She placed them in Sarah's palm as if they were jewels. Then that's a blessing, my love. Sarah managed to smile, though her heart sank. We'll have them scrambled proper. She would give the children the larger portions and tell herself she wasn't hungry. She had grown skilled in the small deceptions of a pie. Mother, breakfast was a quiet affair, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, as Sarah sent them off on their mile-long walk to the schoolhouse, their worn boots leaving faint prints on the muddy track, she stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. Only when their small figures had vanished over the rise did she allow the dam of her composure to break. Turning back inside, she gripped the edge of the rough-hewn table William had built, her fingers tracing the nicks and whorls in the wood. Hot tears slid down her cheeks. "Oh, William," she whispered to the empty room, "how am I meant to do this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as it did every day. But grief was a luxury, and survival was a necessity. She wiped her eyes on the corner of her apron, taking a long, steadying breath. Her children needed her to be strong. She squared her shoulders, standing as tall as William had always taught her. "A Collins doesn't slouch," he used to say, "no matter the burden." And so Sarah stepped outside to face the vast, unforgiving Montana sky, ready for another day's fight. She did not know that just beyond the horizon, a storm was gathering, a storm that carried not just rain, but destiny. The storm did not arrive with a warning. It fell upon the prairie like a judgment. The sky, which had been a placid gray only an hour before, turned a bruised, sickly green. The wind ceased its lonely tune and began to moan like a grieving spirit, rattling the cabin's lone window pane in its frame. Sarah was securing the latch on the chicken coop when she heard it, not the wind, but her son's voice. It was a cry sharp with a terror she had never heard before. "Mama! Come quick, Mama!" Her heart seized. Dropping the rope, she gathered her worn shawl around her shoulders and ran, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She followed the sound of his voice to the edge of the half-plowed wheat field. Emma was already there, standing as rigid as a fence post, her small hand covering her mouth. Before them, crumpled in the mud, lay a man. Beside him, a magnificent black stallion lay still in death, its saddle a masterpiece of dark leather and intricate Mexican silver that glinted dully in the fading light. The man himself was of a piece with the horse, even soaked and mud-caked. His wool coat was finely tailored, and his boots were of a quality that could have fed her family for the entire winter. His clothes spoke of money, but the Montana mud was claiming them without prejudice. "He's breathing, Mama," Emma whispered, her face pale in the gathering gloom. Sarah crossed herself, a prayer forming on her lips. A dark stain was spreading across the man's chest, the unmistakable signature of a bullet wound. Every rational thought screamed at her to turn back, to gather her children and bar the door. They had nothing, less than nothing. Charity was a luxury for those with full larders and warm homes, not for a widow with 90 days left on a note. But then she looked at the man's face, slack with unconsciousness, and she thought of William. In his final days, his own breath a shallow, desperate thing. He had been a soul in need. And her faith, however battered by hardship, whispered that you couldn't ask God for a miracle in one breath and turn your back on one in the next. "We can't just leave him, Mama," Emma said, her voice firm with a wisdom beyond her years. Her daughter was right. It wasn't in them to do it. "Thomas, run ahead. Build up the fire, hot as it will go," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. "Emma, you'll have to help me. We'll take him by the arms." He was a large man, solid with muscle, and dragging his dead weight toward the faint light of their cabin tested every bit of her strength. They stumbled and strained, the wind whipping at their skirts, but they did not stop. Inside, Thomas had the fire blazing, casting dancing shadows on the walls as they hauled the stranger across the floorboards. "Emma, the herb box." "Thomas, clean rags and a basin of water," Sarah ordered, shifting from frightened mother to capable nurse. Her hands, though trembling slightly, moved with a practiced economy. She had seen the work of bullets before, in a different life. It seemed as she cut away the fine fabric of his shirt. She saw that the wound was ugly, but the bullet had passed through. He would have a chance. While she worked, cleaning the wound with a precious distillation of yarrow from her garden, she noticed other marks on his body, the thin, silvery lines of old knife scars and the puckered tissue of past bullet wounds. This man's life had been written in violence. A tremor of fear returned. What manner of man had she brought into her home, near her children? Then she saw something else. Tucked in his vest pocket was a silver watch, stained with blood, but exquisitely made. She gently worked it free and opened the cover. An inscription was elegantly engraved inside. "To my J.W. With eternal love, Margaret. He had been someone's dear one. He had been loved. That was all she needed to know. Through the long night, as the storm raged outside, they tended to him. The children worked beside her, their young faces etched with worry and a solemn purpose. As his fever rose, he began to murmur, his words disjointed fragments of another life. "Margaret, forgive me, the papers, must protect." Dawn was breaking when his fever finally broke. Sarah, exhausted, had sent the children to their bed. She sat in the quiet, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, The strong lines of his face softened in sleep, as the first weak rays of sunlight slanted through the window. His eyes fluttered open. They were a startling blue, clear, and intelligent despite the fever's haze. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, confusion giving way to a dawning understanding. "You saved me," he said. His voice was a rough whisper, but it was gentle. Sarah simply nodded, suddenly aware of her own disheveled appearance, of the poverty evident in every corner of their small home. "Rest now," she said softly. "The questions can wait." She rose to get him some water, but he reached out and caught her hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you," he whispered, a world of sincerity in the two simple words. Then his eyes closed again, this time in a natural, healing sleep. Sarah stood there for a moment longer, his touch still warm on her skin, with the inexplicable certainty that after this night, nothing would ever be the same. The next 2 days passed in a hushed vigil, measured by the rise and fall of the stranger's fever. Sarah maintained a fragile sense of normalcy for the children, sending them to school each morning, but she saw how their thoughts remained in the small cabin with their mysterious guest. He was a man of contradictions. In the grip of delirium, his words were a tangled tapestry of grief and danger. He would murmur a woman's name, Margaret, his voice thick with a sorrow so profound it made Sarah's own heart ache. In the next breath, he would speak of duty and defense, the double H. "Must be protected," he'd rasp, his hands clenching as if gripping reins or a weapon. He spoke of ambushes, of betrayal, of papers that must not be found. Yet in his brief moments of lucidity, his manners were those of a gentleman. "Ma'am," he'd said one afternoon, his blue eyes clear for a fleeting moment as she offered him a precious broth, "I cannot take food from the mouths of your children." "Nonsense," Sarah had replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "A body needs fuel to mend. Now drink." And he had, with a look of quiet gratitude. The mystery of their guest followed the children even to the schoolhouse. Thomas came home one evening clutching a crumpled piece of paper he'd found tacked to a post near the mercantile. It was a wanted poster, its rough sketches depicting a trio of hard-faced men wanted for terracing ranches to the south. Over their meager dinner of potato soup, the children whispered their theories. "He's a lawman," Thomas declared, his eyes wide with excitement. "Hunting them down." "Or maybe," Emma countered, ever the pragmatist, "he's the one they're hunting." Sarah hushed them both, though the same questions had been circling in her own mind. His fine clothes suggested a man of means, but the scars on his body and the words from his fevered dreams spoke of a life lived on the edge of violence. On the third morning, the fever broke for good. As Sarah changed his bandages, she saw the change immediately. The fever's haze had lifted from his eyes, leaving behind a clear, sharp intelligence that watched her movements. There was color in his cheeks that wasn't born of illness. "Your children," he said, his voice stronger now, catching her by surprise. "You've raised them well. They have good hearts." Sarah paused, her hands still. "Thank you. They've had to grow up too quickly." His gaze moved around their humble cabin, taking in the patched walls and worn furniture, and he nodded with an understanding that felt older than his years. "Hard times can do that." He paused. "I would not presume to offer charity, Mrs. Collins, but I am a man who pays his debts." Before she could form a reply, pride stiffening her spine, he offered the first payment. "My name is Harrison," he said simply, "James Harrison." It was the first solid piece of truth she'd had from him, a formal introduction that seemed to change the air in the room. She was about to ask what business brought him to Montana when the cabin door burst. Open. It was Emma, breathless and pale, her eyes wide with fright. "Mama, riders are coming. I saw them from the ridge." James Harrison's reaction was instantaneous. The weary patient vanished. In his place was a man forged in crisis, his body tense and alert despite the fresh wounds. "The root cellar," he commanded, his voice low and urgent as he pushed himself to sit up. "Get the children inside. Do it now." He met Sarah's shocked gaze, his blue eyes like chips of ice. "If anyone asks, you have seen no one. You understand? Not a soul has passed this way." Sarah stood frozen for a heartbeat, the man's. New name on her lips and the sudden terrifying dread gripping her heart. The violence he had dreamt of was no longer a fevered memory. It was riding toward their door. There was no time for questions. Sarah's hands flew to her children, hurting them toward the heavy cellar door and the floorboards. "In you go," she whispered, pressing a finger to her lips for silence. "Don't make a sound until I come. For you." She saw the fear in their eyes, but also a flicker of trust, and it fortified her. She slid the door shut, smoothed her apron, took a single, deep breath to steady her hammering heart, and opened the cabin door just as 3 riders reined in their horses. They were hard-looking men, coated in trail dust, with weapons worn openly and without apology. The leader, a man with a jagged scar that pulled at one side of his mouth, touched the brim of his hat with a mockery of politeness that didn't reach his cold, flat eyes. "Afternoon, ma'am," he drawled. "We're tracking a friend of ours." Tall fellow, well-dressed, might have passed this way. Sarah met his gaze, channeling every ounce of the quiet strength her William had possessed. "I've seen no one fitting that description," she said, her voice even. "We don't get many visitors out this far." The man's eyes narrowed, scanning her face for any sign of a lie. Behind him, his companions let their gazes drift over her property, taking in the sagging barn roof and the meager livestock with predatory interest. "You wouldn't mind if we had a look around?" "Just to be thorough." "I would mind," Sarah replied, her voice still quiet but now edged with steel. "This is my home, and I don't allow strange men near my children. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have chores to attend to." She held her ground, her hand resting on the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For a long moment, the leader just stared, as if weighing the trouble she might be against the information he wanted. Finally, with a curt nod to his men, he wheeled his horse around. Only when they were distant figures on the horizon did Sarah shut the door, the strength draining from her legs as she sagged against the rough-hewn wood, trembling. That evening, after she had tucked the children into bed with reassurances she did not feel herself, she faced James. He was sitting up by the fire, looking less like a patient and more like the man of action she had glimpsed earlier. "Those men," she began, her voice low in the quiet cabin. "They were not your friends." "No, ma'am, they were not," James said, his gaze steady. "And I thank you for what you did today. That was a brave thing. Lying doesn't come easy to a woman like you." "What I told them was the truth," she countered, settling into William's old chair. "I haven't seen their friend. I've only seen a wounded man who needed help." A faint smile touched his lips. "You have a way with words, Mrs. Collins." He grew serious again. "It's time you knew the whole truth, the risk you've taken." He told her then of Marcus Blackwood, a powerful man who wanted to own the entire territory, and of his relentless efforts to acquire James's ranch, the Double H, by any means necessary. The ambush had been his latest, most violent attempt. "You and your children risked everything for a stranger," James said, his voice soft but intense. "You deserve to know who that stranger is, and you deserve to be protected from the consequences. We didn't help you expecting a reward, Mr. Harrison. I know you didn't. That's precisely why you deserve one." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded document, placing it on the small table between them. "I took the liberty of settling your account with the bank in town." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hand flew to her chest. "You had no right." "Perhaps not," he agreed, holding up a hand to forestall her protest. but I had the means. Please do not think of it as charity. Think of it as the first payment on a debt, Mrs. Collins. A debt for my life. Your home is safe." Tears of relief and fierce, stubborn pride pricked at her eyes. She couldn't speak. "But that's not all," he continued, leaning forward. "That is merely settling the past. I want to propose something for the future." He described her land, its good bones, the water source, its potential. This place could be productive again, with the right investment. A new barn, proper fencing, quality stock. He looked at her, his expression earnest. "I need good people, Mrs. Collins. Honest people. The Double H is a large operation, and I want to start a new breeding program on this section of land. I'm proposing a partnership. I will provide the capital. You will manage the homestead. You would be paid a fair wage, plus a percentage of the profits." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. He wasn't offering a handout. He was offering an opportunity. A future. It was the miracle she had prayed for, laid out on the table before her in the form of a business proposition. I'll need to think on it," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Of course," he said, nodding in understanding. He stood, his movements still stiff from his injury, and moved toward the simple cot they had made for him. "Just know this," he said, turning back to her. "I'm not looking for a charity case. I'm looking for a partner." After he had settled for the night, Sarah remained at the table, staring at the bank notice. Outside, the world was dark and filled with threats she was only beginning to understand. But inside, on the table before her, lay a map to a future she hadn't dared to dream of, and she was faced with the terrifying, exhilarating weight of choosing whether to follow it. It was a decision made not in the quiet desperation of night, but in the clear, cold light of dawn. With the banker's paid-in-full notice held in her hand like a shield, Sarah met James Harrison's gaze across the breakfast table. She would accept his proposition, not as a woman in need of rescue, but as a partner ready to work. She would not be a recipient of his fortune. She would be a builder alongside him. His nod was solemn, a silent acknowledgement of the terms her pride had set. And with that, the world began to change. The silence that had haunted the Collins homestead was replaced by the ring of hammers and the rasp of saws. A crew of men, hired by James from the town, descended upon the property, their presence a whirlwind of productive energy. The sagging roof of the barn was torn down, and in its place, a new sturdy frame began to rise against the vast Montana sky. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled the air, a fragrance of progress that pushed back the lingering scent of decay. Fences were mended, new posts were sunk deep into the earth, and one morning a small herd of healthy, fine-looking cattle arrived, their lowing a rich and vital sound that the hills had not heard in years. The town noticed. Mr. Caldwell, the banker, now tipped his hat to her on the street, his smile suddenly as broad as his mustache was thin. The clerk at the mercantile, who had once watched her count out her pennies with a pitying eye, now addressed her as Mrs. Collins with a newfound respect. She was no longer just the poor widow on the edge of town. She was James Harrison's partner, and the weight of his name opened doors she never knew existed. But the most profound changes were happening within the walls of her own small cabin. James, as he recovered his strength, became a quiet but constant presence in their lives. He was no longer just a guest. He was a mentor. He spent afternoons with Thomas, not just showing him how to whittle a piece of wood, but teaching him the nature of it. "You have to read the grain, son," he'd say, his voice gentle. "A man's character is like that too. You have to work with it, not against it." Under his patient guidance, Thomas's small hands, once clumsy, grew steady. And sure, with Emma, he saw a different kind of strength. He recognized the keen, practical intelligence behind her serious eyes. He brought 2 gentle mares to the homestead, and as he taught her to ride, he taught her much more. "Look at her ears, Emma," he'd instruct as she sat atop her horse in the new corral. "A horse tells you its whole story right there. Managing a ranch isn't about giving orders. It's about listening to what the land and the animals are telling you." He spoke to her not as a child, but as a future equal. Sarah would watch them from the porch, a dishcloth idle in her hands. She saw the way Thomas squared his shoulders a little straighter after a word of praise from James. She saw the way Emma's face lit up with purpose when he gave her a ledger and began teaching her about numbers and accounts. She saw the father he might have been, the family man he had lost, and a warmth would spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the midday sun. One evening, after the children were asleep and the sounds of construction had ceased, she found him on the porch, staring out at the rising frame of the new barn, silhouetted against a sea of stars. "It's good work," he said quietly without turning. "A strong foundation." "Yes," she agreed, coming to stand beside him. "It is." They stood in a comfortable silence, the kind that no longer needed to be filled with words. He was talking about the barn, she knew. But as she looked at the dark, solid shape rising from the earth, Sarah had the distinct feeling they were both thinking of the other foundation being laid, one of shared work, of quiet respect, and of the slow, steady healing of two lonely hearts. They were building more than a ranch. They were building a life, post by post, beam by beam, and she was beginning to feel the shape of it in her own soul.